Hold on.
All right, welcome everyone to Woke Wednesdays. We are grateful for your participation, grateful for your presence virtually as we do this freedom ride across the nation, trying to embody something new, even as we draw on the spirit of our ancestors. These are kind of Sankofa experiences where we are looking backwards as a way of fueling ourselves, fueling our energy, a way of grounding our spirits, and a way of fetching the wisdom of our ancestors as we move forward. We know that it cannot be overstated how significant this moment in American history is, and it would be really, really tragic. It would be lamentable if we fumble this experience that we have to make this nation live up to its founding principles, to make this nation live up to what it says it is on paper, as we continue to commemorate the lives of Reverend C.T. Vivian and Representative John Lewis, who are only the most recent of our ancestors who have become ancestored, who are now ancestors, that they have left us with a significant task of loving America out of the hell that it has created for Black and brown and poor folk, to love the hell out of America. I think that is one of the enduring lessons that we at least take from Representative Lewis, that he had a profound love for democracy, even when this nation seemingly did not love him and love his people the way that he and we deserve. And so we are in conjunction with Faithful Black Lives and the Black Church Action Fund, convening various conversations, curating conversations about how do we maximize, how do we optimize this particular moment of crisis into an opportunity to build Black political power, to build Black economic power. And we want to do that by starting this conversation by thinking about transitioning from the protest energy, the protest spirit that we're seeing all over the country, in urban areas, all over the country, major cities, all over the area, into real political power that leads to legislative wins, power that leads to judicial appointments, power that leads to very clear economic benefits and gains in our communities. And I'm joined today by three great minds, by three great leaders who are on the front line of being what I often call first responders of democracy. That democracy is flatlining often, particularly in my lifetime. I don't know a time where I've been conscious enough to say that our democracy has been flatlining since we've seen from 2015 until now. Of course, there's greater history, a deeper historical analysis that needs to be taken. But in terms of how I'm feeling in this moment, I'm feeling as if democracy is flatlining, is really in jeopardy. But it's persons like these three that we have here who are part of a lineage of democracy first responders, people who are showing up when our systems are not living up to how they've been established, when our structures are actually praying instead of protecting the most vulnerable. We have three people who represent institutions, represent leadership traditions that are responding to the crisis that many of us are simply living through and we don't have answers for. So I'm grateful to be joined by Dr. Jacqueline Thompson, who is the senior pastor of the Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, California. She is a history maker. She is the first woman to serve in that role and was the first woman, I believe, to serve as the associate pastor of that church that has been a church that's been aligned well before Black Lives Matter. It was a church that was aligned with the Black with the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers. And so she is continuing a very deep tradition that we need to see more of. So grateful for Dr. Jackie being with us today. Grateful for my former boss being with us today, my big brother, Pastor Michael Warren, who is the senior pastor of the First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem, the FCBC movement, which is a church that is defying all the odds of gentrification and all the odds of what it means to do religion in New York City. He is setting a model for what it means to be a cultural architect, but also what it means to be a social justice warrior. So grateful to have Pastor Mike on with us, and grateful to have attorney Yolanda Melville with us today. She's my new boss here in Atlantic County. She is a leader, not just of our NAACP chapter locally in Atlantic City, but she is also the leader of the NAACP Next Gen movement, Next Gen group, and we are grateful for all that she represents as it relates to policy and policy advocacy, but also in terms of political strategy. So we're grateful to have the three of you all here to have a conversation about how we move from protest to real political power. So welcome, my brother and my sisters. So I'll give you some chance if there's more about your bio, more about your context that we need to know, because each of you are doing significant things that I really want you to brag on yourselves, so that you can help to set the model for what needs to happen around the country through civil rights organizations, nonprofit organizations, and churches. But can you just open us up talking about what the protest mood is in your respective cities, and how you're reading that mood? Is it sustainable? What was it? Was it short-lived? Just give us a feel on, in this particular moment where we are still seeing people protesting in places like DC, places like New York, where Pastor Mike are. How is the protest mood in your city, and how are you reading it in terms of its sustainability or its short-livedness? And let's start with Attorney Melville.
Well, Dr. Francois, I think that you're my boss, but I appreciate the humbling remarks. But certainly, I'm grateful to be here. I'm humbled, not like you said, just to serve here in Atlantic County, but also to serve a conglomerate of the brightest young minds I know in the civil rights movement today. I serve over 400 young leaders in over 33 states. And we've been trained intentionally by the NAACP to really carry out the objectives of civil rights and social justice and the missions and the values of the NAACP. And I also serve as one of the inaugural fellows of the Higher Heights Senior Leadership Program, which is intentional about training and cultivating Black women leadership. So there's this duality of my purpose, and that's really what I'm going to speak about today. But you asked me about the protests, and I think I have a microcosm and then I have a macro view, right? So here in Atlantic City, in Atlantic County, we have a Black county prosecutor who recently wrote an op-ed about the intersection of race and injustice in this country. And he wrote it to the words of Marvin Gaye, "What's Going On." We have people here. We have a Sikh American is our attorney general for the state of New Jersey. We have a governor who is receptive, who understands that Black power is important. We have a first lady who understands infant mortality, and I can go on and on, but they have made it intentional about understanding Black issues and understanding that Black power is so important. But really, when it came to the microcosm of the protest, people are still upset. People are still angry. They feel that they have been marginalized. Here in the southern part of New Jersey, we are very much a casino economy. Our ebb and flow of how we rise or fall depends on the tourism. And then we have this overarching health pandemic that is seizing any opportunity for us to just thrive. And that's really, under normal conditions, is problematic, but under a public health crisis that's really attacking our communities, it's even more problematic. But I also look at my brothers and sisters who are next gen leaders around the country in these 33 states. I have, watched my colleagues, those who are younger than me, get arrested for being on the lawn of the Attorney General's lawn in Kentucky. I've watched my brother, who is 26 years old, rise as the youngest state conference president in the history of the NAACP, speak words that I've never heard and really galvanize young people. They are my inspiration, But what we do is, as a collective, we are certainly, not all of us can be on the front lines. There's some of us in the back fueling the efforts. Not everybody can protest. You know, we have concerns, health concerns that preclude some of us who live in multi-generational families who may have to be a caretaker to somebody who is more sensitive to having health crises occur. That your participation doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be in the front line. There are a panoply of ways that you can participate, and I think we'll get into them. But certainly, I am inspired by people who have literally put their lives on the line to exercise their franchisement and tell people that they're serious about having a living chance in this world. And that's I'll turn it over to the rest of the panelists, but that's where I am. I'm inspired.
Thank you. Dr. Jackie?
Good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank you for the invitation, Dr. Francois, and I certainly greet this distinguished panel. And thank you for representing the West. I don't want to throw up my West Side sign. Often we get left out of these conversations. But if you know anything about the Bay Area, you know that the spirit of protest is alive. You know, the Black Panther spirit lives on. And honestly, what I appreciate about Oakland in particular is we don't really need an issue in our area. We will protest in solidarity with anybody if anything is going on around the country. And so that spirit of protest is alive. But in the same vein, we have to be very, very honest that whenever protest breaks out, regardless of whatever city, whatever area, there is also an active campaign to quiet the protest and to squash the voice. And so we've been experiencing a lot of that because people are no longer in the streets, because it is no longer shutting down or disrupting folks' way of life. You're starting to see people weary. And so I think protest fatigue is a very real thing, coupled with the impact of COVID-19 and the disproportionate cases that we're looking at my church. We're a testing site, we're a drive-through site. We've tested to date about 14,000 people. And so we're excited about that, but at the same time, recognize that with all of the active energies that are being used to keep people silent and to quiet their voices, it's becoming a challenge. And I think protest being sustainable, it's possible, but we have to look at several things. And I think for us in our area, because our protests tend to be not singularly Black, but we have other cultures and other ethnicities that come alongside of us, oftentimes our message is co-opted. And when the message becomes co-opted, or when those who have different agendas show up and our nonviolent protest turns violent, then it kind of shifts the conversation and it shifts that support that we need in order to take protest to the next level. And so while I'm happy that it's still happening, I think around the nation, we have to look at some bigger challenges, and a lot of it has to do with it ending right at the protest. I think we are missing that bridge that takes it from the fury in the street to actual policy that can be enacted in our local and national government structures. So I'll leave it there for now.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Jackie. Pastor Mike?
Yeah, I'll just briefly piggyback on what Dr. Jackie said. A few weeks ago, maybe a week ago, Attorney General Barr was before Congress in a hearing, and he said many things that were rather interesting and intriguing. But when they asked him to give his take on Antifa and other kind of umbrella movements, he said something that was quite alarming. He said that what we've noticed from these movements, now he didn't name Black Lives Matter, but it was clear from his statement that he was including Black Lives Matter in that. And what he said is that what we noticed is that these organizations, and he used the term organization loosely. He said these groups are great at organizing for the event. Beyond the event, he said, we don't see any real organizational structure or consistency. Now, that is important because what we see, especially here in New York City has been in some ways ground zero for so many protest movements. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised. I've seen protests ad nauseum. I mean, we can go back to Eric Garner, Sean Bell, Yusef Hawkins in '89. I mean, the list goes on. And I've been in activist work for about 34 years now. And so what we have seen is that we have the capacity to galvanize energy for the event. And we've reduced in some frameworks the protest to the event. And what I tell people, if the event is not attached to intentional policy strategy and an outcome, I said, then it becomes public venting. Now, public venting is fine because that's necessary. We have to be able to give voice to the pain, the damage, the woundedness that exists in our communities. We have to be able to give pain to the outrage and the rage that exists. But at the same time, if there's no intentional connection to attaching the protest to policy initiatives that have an outcome, then we miss the moment. Look, we saw Occupy Wall Street. We saw that come and we saw it fade.
Right.
And it faded hard because it became what it got reduced to in some areas where people who upset, young people who came, they were occupying, but there was a glaring blind spot. I actually wrote an article about it. Here they were occupying Wall Street, protesting against the quote unquote 1%, the super wealthy in this country. And then they had food being served. But some of them did not allow the homeless people in the park to participate in the meals that were being served, which meant that how consistent was the ethical and moral consistency in the outrage when in the midst of protesting the 1%, you ignore the overlooked and the underserved, right? So if you don't have connection between the protest and the policy, then it will fade. It will dead end. That's why you have to be able to do both at the same time. And guess what? We have the capacity to do both at the same time. I was on a radio show yesterday and I raised the date, June 25th, 2013. June 25th, 2013 was probably one of the most pivotal days, in the past 10 years, within the past 10 years, in the midst of all the movements that have taken place, in the midst of all the protests. June 25th, 2013, it was a Tuesday because the Supreme Court gave the ruling on Shelby County versus Holder. That was the day when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Basically, killed Section 4 and Section 5. Which meant that there was no longer need for federal pre-clearance to change any state laws with regard to voting, which if you understand the language of the civil rights movement, it was a reduction back to states' rights, okay? Which is always codified language for white supremacy and the myth of racial superiority, right? So take that. On that day, I was on the phone doing co-hosting a show with Al Sharpton. He was in DC, I was in New York. I said, Rev, how many people are outside the Supreme Court right now? He said maybe about 250 at most. 250. No protest, no outrage. There was no marching, no rally. And we watched the rolling back of opportunities, access, and rights that were granted by blood, sweat, and tears. Now, here's what I would suggest as something I hope we all talk about. The protest is critical. The outrage is critical. Giving voice to the rage and anger is critical. But sometimes we have a tendency to protest the overt and the obvious. Right. It is not that the overt and the obvious cannot be protested. It should be. Police brutality should be protested. It is insane because this country has a historical problem with Black and brown bodies, and it gets reduced into the very fabric of every institution in this country. But at the same time, there are things we miss if we get fixated and intoxicated with the obvious and the overt and miss what is being done, right? I always tell people, and this analogy, and I end it here, this is a chess game that's happening. Mm-hmm. In a chess game, it doesn't count if you're a master checkers player. Mm-hmm. And too often, too many of our folk are master checkers player in an intense chess game. And we miss the opportunities for transformation, impactful transformation, and to really connect this stuff to things that can stick. It is easy, and you and I have talked. We are giving people passes because they wear a shirt, have a banner, and wave a flag. When there's no systemic change being made in certain institutions, and we're giving institution passes because they put a commercial that says Black Lives Matter, they kick money to Black Lives Matter efforts, but there's no systemic change within those institutions. Still white, still majority male, still dominated that way. So unless we start broadening the bandwidth of our targets, we will always find ourselves repeating this same historical moment over and over again and narrowing the targets, but maybe missing the bigger targets. So I'll stop there.
Dr. Mike, can I press you even on something that you raised? And actually, Yolanda, you raised this as well, because I do think that sometimes it is not just a response to the overt. I think that reality, because that is true, is often indicative of the splintering that takes place in our own community when we are protesting. We start out fine around the one issue. We all come together because we've seen the video, because we've heard the newscast. We know the issue. But somehow when we get in the thick of it, we allow ourselves to become divided over what I call righteous arguments but it ends up in a non-righteous result. And so we get caught up in debate about who's on the front line, who's actually holding a sign, or is that the more efficacious role as opposed to who's sitting at the table in corporate America able to have the conversation. And so I think there's some onus on us as well to not only expand our bandwidth, but we have to be willing to expand our network. I recognize every Negro is not the same Negro, right? But if you are the person, if we don't agree on every platform, but you have access to the room that I need to get into in order to bring this issue, and if you can speak and interpret it in a way that the person who needs to hear it can hear it, then I think we have to learn how to bridge some divides and build some nexus with some folk that we may not agree with on the ground floor.
Right. Yeah. To touch upon what you were going to say, because I was actually going to bring it up, and I have a date for you, and that's tomorrow. Tomorrow, August 6th, is the 55th anniversary since the enactment of that same Voting Rights Act. And certainly that was something that we need to be mindful of. We are in a pandemic. It's been 150 years since Black men were afforded the right to vote in this country. It's been 100 years since non-minority women received the right to vote. But it was really that Voting Rights Act that gave us all a level playing field. And once it was dismantled on June 25th of 2013, we're really now starting to see the effects of it. And And really, as a legal practitioner and someone who was a civil rights advocate, I was tasked with looking at the nationwide scope of what that dismantling was doing. And the importance of the Voting Rights Act was not necessarily the penalty, it was the deterrence. It was having the legislation in place, having the law be active to deter the bad actors from changing a polling site, from enacting a voter ID that may be an opportunity for voter suppression. But really, it was a gatekeeper. But if you look at the text of that decision, you have two schools of thought. You had the majority opinion saying, well, we don't think that this is necessary because we don't think that voter suppression exists. We don't feel that disenfranchisement is no longer a problem. And therefore, we're going to get rid of this. But if in fact there is an opportunity for, if there's a discussion or an issue with this again, Congress will fix itself. Congress will enact a new law to address it. And since 2013, where have we been? Then you have Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the other side saying that reasoning is flawed for the same reason of saying, I'm going to throw out my umbrella because it's not raining anymore and I'm not wet. It doesn't make sense. And for people who study Black disenfranchisement in American history, it was transparent that within days, weeks, and months of that dismantling of the law, that you saw the same communities enacting not necessarily salient laws, they were overt. They were changing polling locations. And I really want to join this back to what's happening right now, and that's the census. This is the first time in 10 years that we're being counted, but right after the census comes the changing of electoral districts. And we're really going to see the hard issues of where Shelby County is going to lose Black voting electorate, that we do not have those gatekeepers anymore to deter people from changing electoral boundaries, from gerrymandering districts, and really finding ways to dilute our voice. And going back to the original question, Dr. Francois, this is where political power and protest change over to action and understanding the esoteric terms that maybe many of us don't understand. We don't understand apportionment. We don't understand electoral districts. We don't understand stacking, packing, gerrymandering. We don't understand what happened in Shelby County. But we need to influence and train our leaders, our young people, and those who have a high level of understanding to know that eradication of our civil rights is not a immediate game plan. It's a 100-year game plan. It's a 50-year game plan. And there are people whose life is dedicated to dismantling the next 50 years of our civil rights.
I don't want to, I know there's other things, Dr. Willie, you want to hit, but I just want to add this, since we're in the historical framework. This is when I meant the chess match. When, after the second reelection, notice after the second reelection, the reelection rather of Barack Obama, you saw this issue come up with Shelby County. All right.
Right.
So here's what happened. Noam Chomsky calls these folks the masters of mankind, right? Who use their power and their money and their influence to shape cultural narrative and to shape the cultural landscape. There was a commission post-civil rights era in the 70s And there was some influential African Americans on this commission. And it was corporate heads and policy heads and lobbyists. And they said that the civil rights era, really going from 55 to about 72, was too much democracy. It was an era of too much democracy, and their task was to undo the too much, right? Mm-hmm. So when Barack Obama was reelected, the Koch brothers, who had pumped tons of money into undermining the reelection of Obama, they realized, hold on, no matter what they do, if you remember that night, Karl Rove was incensed. He did not believe that these numbers were true. If you saw that, he walked off the broadcast. He couldn't believe these numbers that Barack Obama was winning. And because when they saw that they could not stop a black man from being reelected, they started playing chess. Right. So what did the Koch brothers start doing? They started pumping money and others like them into state races. They decided that if we can flip state houses, right, we can begin to do the work to lessen democracy, to shrink the voter pool, to make sure that if we can, that this doesn't happen again. They were pouring money into state raises, and they flipped houses that were Democrat into Republican. Right now, you have about, I think, 32, 33 state houses in the country that are Republican. Which means, for example, in North Carolina, where I used to live in grad school, when they were trying to change the voting laws that had since became unconstitutional, you had all the people being arrested, all the protests. Here's the difference. All the protests, people were being arrested in droves, Moral Mondays, thousands of people being arrested. And when that legislation hit the governor's desk, he signed it. He looked out the window and saw 1,000 people and signed it. Why? Because the state house was Republican, and he knew he had the support. They changed the game. They shifted the game, shrink the voting pool, reduce the voter turnout. And the biggest key part, if you remember, and I'm sure the attorney knows, when the Supreme Court made that decision, instantly states started enacting new laws. The same day, instantly. How did they have that prep? They were playing chess. They were getting ready.
Honestly, the Koch brothers meet in Palm Springs.
Yeah.
They invite all the heads of corporations, just throwing up West Side again. Yeah. They meet in Palm Springs. And I've raised that because sometimes we have to take lessons from our adversaries. They function with an intentionality. They are not planning for an election. They're planning 10 and 15 years generationally out. And so oftentimes, as you said, we galvanize for the moment, but we are not looking at the long game. And so even though we have the lessons of the civil rights movement and we appreciate all of it took place, we needed Black militancy, we needed the nonviolent direct action, we needed all of that. But had there not been a conversation that translated into legislation, and I think oftentimes that is where we fall short, because we express, we emote, all of that is needed, but we don't sit down intentionally, come into a room and say, let's plan, not for us, not for our children, let's map this out for our grandchildren. Let's not stand and have dumb debates on who's sleeping with who and is the leader of Black Lives Queer and all of the stuff that tends to divide us, because at the end of the day, all of our necks are on the line. And so that's why when it's time to sign the legislation, they realize that voice and what Barb was really saying is that you emoting and expressing your pain does not move me.
We're not afraid of that.
We're not afraid of that.
Even violent listen, the right to assemble is a constitutional right. We don't threaten necessarily, as Chomsky would say, those who have the power. We don't threaten them with assembly, right? Because that's a constitutional right. It's when we bridge, as you said, as you asked the initial question, Dr. Willie, when we make the bridge, as Dr. Jackie said, from the protest to legislation to beginning to create systems and structures in the midst of the protesting that pushes us to a deeper set of engagement, right? And for most of them, what most folk who see these happen, they say, well, we'll just wait it out. We'll wait it out. It'll fade, it'll fizzle, and there'll be no direct ask. There'll be no policy backup. There'll be no looking to shift the table. And that's where the work, that's how the bridge has to happen. To go from protest to policy, we have to be intentional. And the phrase, Dr. Willie, sustained engagement. This is not a race for sprinters. This is a marathon race.
It's absolutely engagement.
I'm interested in Dr. Jackie brought up something really, really important, and that is part of what's wrong with part of what hinders our movements for liberation in this country. And even seemingly what has the potential to derail a movement to oust Trump from the White House is this kind of purity politics that we play in the movement. If we disagree with you on one issue, we throw you away. It's sort of the the antecedent of cancel culture, is that because even the way we're talking, the way certain people talk about Biden, as if he is not one we should put our support behind, because particularly those of us who identify as Democrats, we shouldn't put our support behind him because of certain historical positions that he held. But it's that kind of purity politics that I think stands to suppress the vote in ways that I think are dangerous. But the same kind of purity politics are at play in the history of our movement building. The reason why certain factions of the Black liberation movements, whether it's the nonviolent movement or the more radical movement, weren't always able to come together. You even see Bill Clinton even thinks that he can talk about Black liberation in a way to malign one of our luminaries at the funeral of another one of our luminaries, pitting them against each other at a funeral. How do we, is that playing into white supremacist hands, the idea of white supremacy hands, that we have to be in love with everybody's ideas? We have to all be exactly on the same page in order for us to collaborate and work together. How do we overcome that?
I think in many ways it does. And I would suggest that perhaps it is a function of what Dr. Joy DeGruy, we all know it, of post-traumatic slave syndrome. Because as a people, we have always spent our time trying to be respected and trying to be liked and trying to be embraced. And so we find that playing out in other areas of our community, including our politics. And so this may be the unpopular position or the unpopular view, but it's okay. I don't mind it. I'm in the West. We isolated anyway. But the reality is this. Sometimes when we take those purity positions, I have to wonder if we are really clued in on what's going on. I will be the first to admit Joe Biden is problematic. We understand he's a problematic candidate. We understand that he has a historical record that has not been in the best interest of Black people. But if you line a Joe Biden up with a Donald Trump and try to have any kind of argument other than cast the ballot, then to me, you are helping perpetuate not only a genocide, but your own suicide. Like, come on and let's have a real conversation. We talk about white supremacy and white evangelicals, but the truth of the matter is they lock and load. They lock and load. And even the other presidential candidates in our most recent election who had a disdain for Donald Trump walked into the poll, held their nose, and casted a vote. Because for them, it wasn't about the person, it was about the courts. It was about who would be appointed. It was about the legislation that would impact future generations. And so sometimes we have to make the sacrifice and say, you don't have to be invited to my house. You don't have to come to my church and sing Amazing Grace with my congregation. What I need to do is walk into that booth, hold my nose, cast a vote with someone who is more likely to sit at the table with me and help me and have me help shape their agenda than somebody who is currently every day on television supporting and behaving in a way where Black folks are literally dying at disproportionate rates of something that could have been stopped in January.
Pastor Mike and Yolanda, I want you guys to help me with this, because Dr. Jackie just said something very clear about how Republicans held their nose, particularly, I mean, I want to believe that white evangelical religious leaders held their nose and voted for him anyway. I actually just believe they agree.
I don't think so.
But I want to believe that. I want to believe that about them. But we do know there are some more moderate Republicans who understood the power of the courts, and they held their nose to do that. And I mean, both of you are, one from an activist scholar, pastoral position, other from an activist attorney scholar position. We need to start having conversations about, when we talk about political power, what does that also mean for the courts, right? Because the right, they know what they want about the courts, and they know how to sell it. They know how to sell it on at least two issues: gay marriage and abortion. They have commandeered the judiciary of this country. Donald Trump is going to have 300 judges by the time he leaves office in January. Granted, he leaves office in January. Barack Obama had less than 100 judges in 8 years that were confirmed. What don't we get about the judiciary in terms of how it functions to protect democracy? That's the first part of the question. Maybe Yolanda, handle that one for us. What don't we get about the judiciary? And Pastor Mike, thinking about the movement history that you've read, that you're an expert of, how do we start thinking about using the courts for social change, for the kind of liberative social change we need?
I'll let the attorney speak.
Okay, I'll start first. Right behind me is a set of the Articles of the Constitution, and they ground me in the work that I do. I can't read them, but it gives me a level of understanding on what I'm fighting for. I think the judiciary is an overlooked component of the checks and balances of our democracy. It's one that people don't understand. You know, we talk about me as a legal practitioner. I have to apply for and pass the bar. You know, this aspect of having to go above and beyond my contemporaries to excel in this level of governance and this level of advocacy. That's a supremacist culture. You know, we don't look at it like that, but it is. And there are ways that people have designed language to really keep people from understanding the complexities and nuances of power. And the judiciary is one of them. The way an opinion is written has its coded language. You have to understand what is happening, where the opinion is going, and what precedent setting, if any. There are people behind Donald Trump who understand the importance of that. There are people who are behind Barack Obama who understand that, but there were also people who were against his level of power because he knew that putting somebody in the judgeship for the next 50 years is going to marginalize their own self-interest. Yeah. And they deterred him from doing just that, putting people in place that would really continue to really give an equitable playing field to the rest of the community, those marginalized communities. And they didn't like that. You know, how many times was a Supreme Court nominee stalled by the Republicans in the Senate when Barack Obama was putting up his nominees, whereas how many we've had with Donald Trump. Yeah. So certainly I do my due diligence as a legal practitioner and someone who really believes in this and teaching people how to read this and how to really think about your power and go set your dreams, but don't let this esoteric language deter you from understanding that this democracy belongs to you too. So I'm in the community as a role model, as a legal practitioner, because I didn't know any lawyers in my family. I didn't have any, but I decided in the 8th grade that I went and met one and said I could do his job. And I want everybody to think like that. And the judiciary is a place where we are needed behind the scenes, on the bench, and in that bar. So,
well, let me say this. On the night that Donald Trump accepted the nomination for the Republican Party, there was an interview that most people don't even refer to or refer back to with Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell stated that night that these next 4 years was about the judiciary. He had an intentional and clear plan, and that was to appoint federal judges. We all know this is lifetime, and some people didn't know, lifetime appointments. So that's on that level. It has always been about the judiciary for Mitch McConnell, and we can see by the number of confirmations. And by the way, confirmations are done by Republicans and Democrats. So don't think that only Republicans are doing this as well. So it takes both to get these confirmations through, right? So that happened. If you take what I saw as an epic fail, and I'm gonna come back to something Dr. Jackie said in a second, the Democratic Party was so convinced, and they're really part of the issue, so convinced that it was impossible for their candidate to lose, that they didn't do the due diligence of casting a narrative bigger than Hillary Clinton. That was the entire narrative. It was Hillary Clinton is the best option. She's the most qualified candidate to run for the office in the history of presidential elections. And it was true, but they had a problematic candidate. They had a flawed candidate, and they knew this, and they never cast a larger narrative, and people could not understand. So it was easy for people to say, well, I'm not going to vote because I don't like Hillary. I'm going to stick out. I'm going to stay away from this. It was easy for people to hold their nose. I don't like Hillary. And some Democrats, as we saw in 2016, who actually voted for Trump. We saw that. We know that. Now, here's the problem. If the Democratic Party had cast and put before the people a narrative shaped around the judiciary and the potential for what could happen in this country with a large and whole-scale transformation of the judiciary, It would have caused such fear and panic. People would have said, forget this third party thing. Look, hold my nose. I'm going to vote for Hillary, because at this point, we see what can happen in the cultural and social and political landscape through these judicial appointments. The Democrats missed that. They missed the larger narrative. They missed an opportunity to cast a grand vision to galvanize the Democrats to come out and vote. And it should have been how important it was, one, for Supreme Court justices and that this particular president will have the opportunity to appoint. Because let's be clear, I pray every day for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I kid you not. Because here's what we know, Dr. Willie. We have survived a 5-5-4 decisions. And sometimes Justice Roberts flips. Why? If you listen to interviews with him, he said that he doesn't want his court to be known as a political court. That's why he makes certain decisions, so he doesn't appear to be a pawn of the Republican Party or Donald Trump. He's concerned about his legacy as well. So when you think that he's not going to side with liberals, what does he do? We've been able to survive 5-4 split. Can't survive 6-3 in this country. Cannot survive 6-3. Right. There will be wholesale change, legal change in this country. An attorney can speak to that. Now, with the purity test, yes, this purity test that takes place in our communities in these moments is actually being co-opted by white supremacist ideology and white supremacist politics. When we start saying, as you said, it's this way or no way, that's why Hillary Clinton didn't win. We didn't know how to look at the bigger picture. We got so fixated on what we wanted, we forget sometimes that legal engines, they do churn slowly, but they also churn with compromise at some point along the way. And we can't have the attitude all or nothing. We have to understand something President Obama said at John Lewis's funeral when he eulogized him. He said, we have to follow John Lewis's lead, I'm paraphrasing, in terms of our commitment. And stay with it. It can take 10 years. It can take 20 years. It can take 50 years. I know folk didn't want to hear that. But as you talked about the ancestors, I hearken back to the ancestors. These were people who fought for freedom they knew they would not see. Yes. They fought for a time that they knew they would not partake in. We can't get so fixated on the immediacy and gratification connected to immediate success that we don't understand the investment for my children, my children's children, my children's children's children. And that's why sustained engagement is important. And that's why we can't afford to get sidetracked by this kind of purity politics that undermines our larger vision and larger agenda.
And just never forget that it was legislation that set it off. It was Brown versus the Board of Education.
Legislation.
Right? So when the yelling in the streets didn't work, thank God we had the NAACP, we had attorneys like Yolanda, and folks who knew how to navigate the courts.
Courts.
Right.
And so if we lose that, I'm with you, Pastor Mike. Every time I see it on TV, I'll be like, oh Lord,
yes.
To a small tongue. Don't take it today, Lord. Don't.
Listen,
right.
Every time I get a news.
So we have to recognize that for many people, they are not worried about the issues we're worried about. If they can lock up legislation in the judiciary, then they can control how this nation is governed for the next 100 years.
Absolutely. The changes we're seeing now because of the judicial appointments will last for a generation. And we don't think the damage is done. The damage, as Dr. Thompson and Yolanda said, the damage has already been done.
Right.
Yeah.
Damage has already been done. We're trying to see how we can beat back some of the pain connected to the damage at this point.
Yep.
Right. And that's why we have to cast a larger vision. That's why we must build that bridge from protest to policy, from lashing out to legislation. It's important.
Yolanda, you have the last word.
I just encourage everybody. I'm wearing a go vote. Tell anyone who is not registered to vote. It's life and death. So please just go out and vote and just become active in your communities. Thank you I'm humbled to be on this panel tonight.
Good. We're grateful for Pastor Mike, for Attorney Melville, and for Pastor Dr. Thompson for sharing with us today. Thank you for this brilliant conversation on how we can start to make that bridge, how we can go from lashing out to legislation, how we can go from protest to real political power. This has been another installment of Woke Wednesdays. We hope you'll be with us again next Wednesday at at 6 o'clock, 6 to 6:45. That's how we do it. 45-minute conversations that will change the world. This is the most impactful 45-minute conversation I've ever been a part of, and I hope you all feel the same way. So make sure you're with us again next week. Next week we'll be talking about education policy. We have three persons who will be joining us who are in the ed space, in the education space, who think about policy. So we have to be thinking about what does it mean to fund our schools, what does discipline look like in our schools, but also a new form of school safety, and that is what does it mean to just be present in school in the middle of a once in a century pandemic that many students just this week have been subjected to. So join in. Again, we thank all of the sponsors, all of the leaders of the Black Church Action Fund for gathering us for this Freedom Summer as we take seriously the mantle that has been left to us, that has been passed on to us with great confidence that we believe we can make America America for the first time. Have a great night. Peace.